Welcome to the Recovery.com podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mala, and today I'm joined with Amanda Uphoff. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Mala. Happy for this conversation.
Me too. We're so excited to welcome David Cornwell, a body centered psychotherapist specializing in depression and trauma. With a master's degree in mindfulness based cognitive therapy from Oxford University, Mr. Cornwell integrates nervous system focused healing with techniques like EMDR and somatic experiencing. He's not only the founder of Cihangir Yoga in Istanbul, but also has transformed his own health, overcoming asthma through lifestyle and breathwork changes. Now living in Healer Free in Mallorca. Welcome, David. It's so wonderful to have this conversation with you and connect with you today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Of course. So, can you tell us a little bit about your journey? How did you get into the world of psychology and mindfulness and all of the things that you're so passionate about?
Okay. The short version or the long version?
Hit us with the long version. I love it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I guess it is a long story in some ways. I grew up in the north of Ireland, just outside of Belfast, and I'm from a fishing community. My father was a fisherman, and it wasn't a sort of a normal thing, let's say, for someone to go into meditation or therapy. I come from a small rural village where we were working a lot from a very young age. There was a strong, very strong community. And one of those communities are a wonderful place to be from in some ways. But I think there's a lot of alcohol dependency, for example. Those communities, they also have shadows that are there. For me, I think looking back on it, it was the shadow of the Catholic Church was pretty strong. That definitely affected the culture. It was definitely very present, and different things growing up that in some ways were quite difficult. I was a Catholic who went to a Protestant school, and there was the challenges of growing up in a working class rural fishing community in the north of Ireland. And when, like many of my friends and peers, we had the opportunity to go to university. And when I went to university, I went to England, and very quickly someone gave me a book on meditation almost as soon as I arrived. I found this book and I read it cover to cover within 1 or 2 days. I was like, wow, this is amazing. I've got to learn more. I've got to understand more about this. So that in itself is a little bit of a story, because the friend of mine who gave me the book, he was a person who became my best friend throughout university. We were as thick as thieves. We were partying all the time and doing what young students do. And he was an avid reader. He's one of the few people in my life who I would consider to have been a real reader. He would just read book after book. And I think one of the reasons that we bonded was that we came from a similar background. We came from a working class background where there was very set roles of men versus women. We could relate to each other. And he gave me this book on meditation, and I found myself almost immediately going to the local Buddhist center to learn to practice. And I think from the moment I practiced meditation, I felt that something different. I felt familiar. There was a sense of familiarity with the practice. I felt very at home in them. And I felt like my life had just moved in a new direction. Some new potential had awakened. My friend who gave me the book on meditation, he read it and he never practiced. And almost immediately after leaving university, he died of a heroin overdose. So it showed in some ways the impact of practice, that my life certainly seemed to go in a new direction after practicing, and his went in another way. I often wonder how my life would have been different had I not have practiced meditation. I think there certainly would have been more alcohol, probably would have been more prevalent in it. Who knows what else? So I learned meditation at university, and I was very committed to it. I would practice every day. I became aware that I wasn't going to pursue a career at least in the field which I was studying at university. I knew that wasn't going to be my life. And at the time, I was looking for different retreat centers to live in. I was really committed to practice. In my third year at university, I lived in a meditation community where we were practicing every day. I was still partying all the time, but I was really committed to a practice. And then after university, I wanted to pursue this more. I ended up living in a retreat center in Ibiza, of all places, which might seem like a place that you wouldn't go on a meditation retreat, but it was people who were really practicing. It was very committed. And I think when I went there and started to practice, we were doing, I think, 6 hours every morning. Like, it was pretty intense and it was really deeply transformative. It felt like I was starting to understand my mind more. I was starting to work with real emotional patterns that I had carried for many years. My understanding of the self started to change. It went from something quite fixed and rigid, and my understanding of the self started to become much more adaptive or much more flexible. It wasn't so set. And people were coming from around the world to that retreat center to study, to learn, and to practice. And one of those people was a Turkish lady who was my girlfriend. And then I went back to Istanbul with her. There were some yoga centers and meditation centers in Turkey, but it was at a very basic, more of a basic level. And in 2005, we set up the first major meditation and yoga studio in Istanbul. And that was a huge success. That was an amazing hit. And for some years, we were running these studios. We had one studio in Asia on one side of the Bosphorus. We had one studio on the European side of the Bosphorus. We were training lots of people. We were teaching. It was at that time that somebody in Istanbul told me of a trauma therapy training that was happening just outside Belfast, very close to where I grew up. I think it was in part subsidized, the training, because they wanted to train trauma therapists in the north of Ireland after the Civil War, the Troubles. And I was able to join that training. It was a somatic experiencing training. And yeah, that was to work with trauma, how to transform trauma through connecting to the body, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about after. So I studied in the somatic experience and training in Belfast, which was amazing because it brought me home in some ways. I had left Ireland when I was 18 and I didn't really think of going back. In some ways, I ran from Ireland. I was happy to go. And then suddenly I was going back to Ireland to train as a therapist. And it was very healing for me to be in that space. I had to confront my own shadows and demons and start this process of healing, which I think mindfulness and meditation is great. It can take you a long way, but I feel like there's a real utility in taking stuff into a therapeutic relationship. There's too many blind spots if you're just sitting on a cushion by yourself watching your breath. So I needed that. I needed to go into therapy. I needed to start training as a therapist. That took me to the Karuna Institute. I became a licensed therapist at the Karuna Institute, which is a sort of a sister college of Naropa in Boulder. And I did a training. I became licensed with UKCP, in United Kingdom Council of Psychotherapy. And in my clinical year, licensing as a therapist, there was one of my course mates, his name's Chris Cullen, who was the professor of Buddhist psychology at Oxford University in the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy program. And he was very curious about the work that I was doing in Istanbul. At that time, I'd been involved in setting up what was called Code Lotus, which was a mindfulness clinic within the American hospital in Istanbul that would support families and caregivers who had experienced tragedy or bereavement through mindfulness skills, therapy programs, even yoga, meditation. And this was modeled on the Cleveland Clinic in America on their Code Lavender program. So I was one of the founders of that in the American hospital in Istanbul. And one of the other things that we were doing there was bringing guest speakers, including Gabor Mate, Dr. Daniel Siegel. And Chris Cullen was interested in this He was curious about my story, and he suggested that I apply to Oxford University to study mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And yeah, that was the last major sort of education, which was to bring these mindfulness therapy, all of these things which I had been interested in for many years. And actually, I was able to put them under one umbrella. There was neuroscience, Buddhist psychology, cognitive science, and then using mindfulness clinically to treat depression. Yeah, it was a long journey. It was a journey from being a fisherman's son in a village outside of Belfast, and then getting into meditation and going through a lot of practice. So, like, I've been practicing meditations in a consistent way for now 27 years, since I'm 18 years old, and then finding ways to bring that into a therapeutic relationship, which I finally feel like I've arrived in that, and I do that work in private practice and with my clients.
That's absolutely a major journey. I've got so many questions. I think the first being, you mentioned facing those original traumas, the original things that happened at home, and coming back home to be able to do that. We often say as clinicians that we go into this field to be able to resolve and do a, deep dive into the things that we need to resolve and work through. I know I certainly did. I can raise my hand to that as well. What were some of the challenges that you faced that you needed to confront and work through?
Growing up in the life that I grew up in the village, it's very particular. It's a particular experience. I think the first piece which I mentioned was that it was Catholic. My mother was Catholic, my father was Protestant, which was unusual in those times. And I remember even being in primary school and how we were taught in religion class and starting to get a very fixed view of the self, of right or wrong, of good and bad, and also having very little guidance, especially in teenage years. You had all of these very heavy belief systems, rules, and ideas of how you should be as a man or as a woman. And yet there was very little ritual or guidance to especially guide us through those adolescent years. I started working at a very young age. I remember, I think the first time I earned money from work, I was maybe 9 years old. And by the age of 11, I was working regularly in fish factories. My family owned fish factories. By the age of 14, every weekend and every holiday, I was working in factories. And when I think about it, I think of almost like a loss of innocence, that a time when I should have been playing, learning musical instruments, just exploring freely in nature or whatever it may be, I found myself in a very adult environment, doing very adult jobs, like working extremely hard. But what I was doing as a 14-year-old, there was no difference between that work and what the people who were twice my age were doing. I was expected to do the same physical labor. We were earning money from that. We would earn a paycheck, and all of that paycheck would go into buying cigarettes and alcohol. That was what it was used for at a very young age. I think that was not an easy place to be a child. In many ways, it was a wonderful place to be a child, but in other ways, it was quite difficult. And then I found I did quite well in school. In the north of Ireland, you do something called the 11 plus. You get graded at age 11, and then that determines which school you went to. And I had the option to go to quite a good school. That was a Protestant school. I was a Catholic child. And I found myself going into that environment very innocent. I knew nothing about those differences. And suddenly I found myself, there was maybe out of 120 students, there was maybe 5 of us who were Catholic. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, becoming aware of this difference and then starting to have to hide who I was. That was an interesting experience and something that you honestly don't understand until you look back on it almost. At the time, you're so young, I didn't even talk about it. I didn't share it. I didn't have any language to explain or to understand what was happening. So I think that period was pretty tough. There was a lot to process. And when I got to university, I would say that at that stage, it would have been good to go into therapy or to find something. And I found meditation, and it was very healing, actually. But I needed more than that. But it did have a deeply transformed effect.
So even in finding meditation and mindfulness-based practices, it brought you peace, but were there any conflicts with the way you were brought up and the mindset? Like, how did you navigate getting into it and saying, "Yes, I can adopt this as a practice for myself," and then figuring it out that you wanted to make this an integral part of your work?
In the beginning, I was very deeply conflicted. I went to the local Buddhist center. I was standing in the bus stop, and I remember it today. Do you remember people used to put up signs, an A4 page, and there would be lots of little telephone numbers that would be
Yep,
like
yep.
sliced? And I remember I was standing in a bus stop, and it was on Pilgrim Street in Newcastle. I remember it. And there was a sign for the meditation course and one of these little bits of paper at the local Buddhist center. So I ripped off the number and I went home and I called this number. And yeah, when I went into the Buddhist center, I was deeply confronted by it. And especially as I got deeper into it, into meditation, in the beginning, it was like a 6-week mindfulness of breathing course. It was very secular. Sort of the Buddhism was left at the door. But then as I got more involved, I would see people taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, things like this, and prostrating themselves at the Buddha's feet. And I was never able to do that. That was not for me. And it has never been for me. I don't consider myself a Buddhist, although I do love the teachings of the Buddha. As I understood more, I was able to see it more as a psychological tradition than as a religious tradition, and as a way to understand the mind, to understand the self as an emergent process, that every moment this sort of the self emerges, thought processes emerge, emotions emerge, sensations emerge, and behaviors emerge. And this is happening in every moment. And I was able to understand this tradition more in its sort of psychological framework than in a religious one. And I certainly didn't want a new religion. I'd had enough of religion by the time I'd left home. It took me a long time to figure it out. It was definitely a big conflict. I have to say, going to Oxford University was very helpful because I felt that it was only then that I was able to really have a strong academic foundation in it. I had a pretty good practice, but I was able to really hold it in a very secular way that felt authentic, that felt like I wasn't sacrificing anything, that my experience was an authentic experience of mindfulness, of meditation, and I think of these wisdom traditions, that I wasn't throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but I was integrating all of these different parts in a way that was meaningful, I would say, for myself.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Yeah. I think sometimes that's often misunderstood that you can do that. So thank you for sharing that.
I
Um,
have to say, there's one book, Buddhism Without Beliefs, by Stephen Batchelor, which I find very helpful. It's a very small book,
yeah,
but that's a brilliant resource. If that conflict does
sure.
exist for people and they have a committed mindfulness practice or meditation practice and they're trying to reconcile
Right.
these different parts of the teaching, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you for that resource. So then integrating, you said one of my favorite words. You got into the world of psychotherapy and you're integrating mindfulness based traditions in. Can you tell us a little bit about that and explain for our audience the concept of that integration?
Yeah. If we look at the Buddhist teaching, and I'll refer to the Buddhist teaching, but not in a religious framework, in more of a psychological framework, this understanding that suffering, first of all, that it's qualitatively different to pain. Like everybody is going to have pain in their lives. People's lives, our loved ones die, we get sick, there's disappointments, we don't get what we want. So pain is somewhat inevitable. It's a primary experience. It's felt in the body. It has a physical component. These difficult experiences that we have, if we pay attention, we start to notice the pattern that is in the body, whether it's patterns of sensation, patterns of emotion, patterns of thought that are awakened. But then we have this secondary experience that things should be different than they are. Like there's something wrong. We need to fix, we need to change something. And that in that sort of Buddhist psychological tradition, that secondary experience is optional. That's what they call suffering, and it's optional. My understanding, both in terms of my own mindfulness and meditation practice and in my therapy work, is really to pay attention to those patterns that are awakened in the body moment to moment as we're moving through our life. And sometimes life can be very difficult, very distressing. And we can begin to notice those patterns of thought, patterns of sensation, patterns of emotion, those familiar tightening of the gut, difficult breathing, those old thought patterns, maybe patterns that were coded in our early childhood. And we can begin to see those and create some space for them. I think that's an important piece. It's just finding ways to create opening, to create space, to take the heat out of them, to take the sting out of them. And instead of trying to be in a very aversive relationship where we're pushing away what is difficult in our lives, or in a very kind of desiring or trying to hold on to what is good in our lives, we have to find a way more to have a bit more of an open hand, allowing our life to be as it is, whether the difficult or the good parts. And that's an awareness process, trying to become more sensitive to these patterns that are unfolding in real time, in the moment, in our experience. That's one part of my work. Another part of my work, I think, is coaching people to try and say, okay, it's all well and good. It's not just about acceptance and allowing things to be as they are. It's also recognizing what can be changed, what is within our power to affect and to shift and to change, and to support my clients in that direction. I also find that I'm working at the rehab and in my practice here, and that people are very disconnected from their bodies. They don't have a connection. Like I remember at Oxford University, there was a saying, the body is a taxi to move the brain to different meetings. That was something that the professors would say. They weren't concerned with the body. It was only there to move the head from lesson to lesson. And I think that, especially through trauma, through continuous exposure to stress, especially in early childhood, people become very disconnected from their body, and they don't have that interoceptive awareness, which is something as simple as being able to feel whether your body's warm or cold, whether there's pain or not, whether you're hungry or not, whether you need to rest or not. And it's helping people to cultivate that capacity to be with their inner experience. I think what can often happen is when people turn inwards and they feel what's happening in their body, because they've got so much experience of avoiding it, it just seems overwhelming. And their mind just goes up and out. And too often, and I think this is familiar for many of us, we go on social media, or we have a cigarette, or we make ourselves busy with work, or we drink alcohol, or whatever it might be. And I want to support my clients, and this is something for myself also, to have that movement of down and in, bringing my awareness down into my body and really beginning to understand, or even to know, I think this is a more appropriate word, to know the relationship between the body and mind, to have a deep sense of it, and to have the body as a resource, because I think that is our major resource in our lives. Like this body that we have it's the best way we have to deal with stress. It's the best way we have to metabolize our difficult experiences through the body. And it's very important, and it's often neglected. So that's what I'm trying to support my clients with in psychotherapy.
That's so great, and I 100% agree, and people get scared. I think that's the reason why that disconnect occurs, almost a masking that can happen. Let's just keep working and ignore all of the things going on. Do you recommend someone to start their journey to try to connect with themselves?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that they're disconnected and the body is an intense place. I remember something that happened. I was teaching a retreat, Dr. Mala, this is many years ago. I have two children, and one of my kids was 3 years old, maybe 2 years old, and the other one was 5 years old. And we were in the retreat room, which was a very familiar thing for me to be leading meditation retreats and my children to be running in and out of the place. And I could see how my daughter came into the room, who was 2 years old, and she had some problem. Something was disturbing her, and she just cried as babies do. She was crying and shaking. But my son, who was 5 years old, he came into the room, and the room was filled with people. There was maybe 30 people in the room. And I remember he slipped and fell. I could see that he was in pain. And I also seen how he pretended that he wasn't in pain. I remember like he just put up his collar almost. It reminded me of the Fawns. Remember from the TV program, he just put up his collar and he pretended that he wasn't in pain. He bottled it up and he walked out of the room. So I think that we learn at a very young age to override that instinctual relationship we have with the body, our body's instinctual way of releasing stress, of releasing trauma. So it was this moment of very top-down mind over body. And my kids were living in retreat centers and around meditators, and we were always encouraging them to connect with their body, to breathe. So I just seen this happens very early, and it's to do with, in many ways, like the power of this amazing brain that we have. But one of the things it can do is to override that instinctual release of stress from the body. And I think then that happens all through our lives. We're told how to behave. We're told to sit still at school when we want to move. We grow up in environments where there's addiction, where there's a lot of stress, where there's physical abuse, violence. I lived in different cultures where there was stress. Those cultures themselves came with stress, but certain stresses built in. Where is a good starting point? I think anything that begins to reconnect you. I started with meditation, with sort of Zen style meditation. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend that for people. It's very tough, it's very solitary. When I think of nervous system regulation and the work of Stephen Porges, I can relate to this myself. Going into a environment where you would sit still and not talk to anyone, it was very familiar to someone like me who was very frozen, who had that freeze, that sort of dorsal vagal freeze of the nervous system. I would say that's, in terms of practicing meditation, learning mindfulness, that's maybe a shadow of those things. Often you find practices, behaviors that fit your nervous system dysregulation type also. And again, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I got so much from that. Because I was more frozen, I could really relate to that freeze in my nervous system as a, let's say, as a nervous system type. It was more freezy. I needed to go into therapy where there would be relationship. I needed someone to guide me out of that space. It's hard to say where someone should start. People need to find the practices that suit them. We can understand yoga posture practice as a trauma model, that you bring awareness into the body. You have all of these ways of shifting your attention. You move into a posture, you arrange your arms and legs, hands and feet into a certain position. It moves the attention to the distal parts of the body away from the core, which can be overwhelming for some people. That core experience, if you pay attention to it, it can dysregulate you. So you're moving into a posture, you're holding it. The first thing you're doing is arranging the shape of the posture, which is moving the awareness, as I said, into more distal parts. Then you're settling into the posture. The awareness naturally shifts more towards the core. There's also this breath awareness, which is helping you to regulate and move attention towards maybe those stronger sensory processes, and then back to the breath, back to the sensory processes. And then you move into a new position, maybe after 5 breaths or after a minute, something like this. And then you come back to stillness in mountain pose or whatever it might be. So you can see it's a bit like going through the gears of a car. It's creating this flexibility in the nervous system, and it's helping you to touch those pockets of stress, of overwhelm, of discomfort in the body, of being uneasy in the body, and then very quickly moving the attention into a new shape and then coming back to the core. So I don't know. I think that there's so many different practices and ways that could be put under the umbrella of embodied practices. And that could be yoga, meditation, or embodied therapies.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that we see as providers, practitioners, teachers, and likely have experienced ourselves is when that sense of overwhelm takes over, that can feel scary, right? It's
Yeah.
that moment where you're in the middle of practice and all of a sudden the tears are flowing and you're like, where did this come from? Or maybe you do know where it came from, but it's happening. How to work through that? What are your recommendations?
One of the things I always say to my clients is that trauma therapy doesn't need to be traumatic. It shouldn't be traumatic. I remember the term to shepherd the client's experience. I thought that was very helpful. Well, I think mindfulness also helped us, but working with resourcing through the senses, through the five senses, I think was very helpful, that it could really ground a client in the present moment, in their sensory experience. And that would start to uncouple then the past from the present. We would be remembering our experiences rather than reliving them. I think that was an important piece for me, and supporting clients to experience and to be connected to the sort of smaller waves of nervous system activations. When I'm working with a client, I'm trying to avoid spaces. I'm trying to support the client in a way that they don't become overwhelmed as much as possible. And I think the somatic experiencing skills are particularly helpful in that regard. We're able to support the client to connect with the parts of their experience that are very resourcing, that are more grounded, and really establishing that sort of sense of containment before we start to move into and explore more activating content that the client may want to present. At the same time, I think it's inevitable that at times the client does become overwhelmed in sessions, and they do experience that. I am really working in a model, in a framework that before we work with any traumatic content, any content that is likely to overwhelm, that we establish a strong therapeutic relationship with the client. We've worked a lot of the less activating content. We've built resources into the client's experience. I've helped to shepherd or to train the client so that their nervous system, that it knows how to go through cycles of activation and release. So that I think actually more than train is to remember, because I think the nervous system, that's what it does. It knows how to activate and it knows how to release. And I try to support clients for their body to have to remember that wisdom that it has. I try to see clients medium to long term, because I think that it takes time to build that relationship and to build that way of working, and for their nervous system to remember. Because I think once we start to remember that the body has this capacity to become activated and then to release and to discharge stress, it starts to do it by itself. It's not something that we need to remember, or we don't have to consciously go through those activation and discharge cycles with every stress that we have in our life. Once we can establish that or re-establish that capacity to trust the body, to listen to the body, to release those patterns of holding that are there, then hopefully when the client does experience that overwhelm within the session, on the meditation cushion, or just in their life, that they have the capacity to naturally release it and discharge it without becoming too overwhelmed. Because that's inevitable in people's lives. People are going to experience stressful, difficult stuff. And I think what we want to do is to get their nervous system to a place where it's just able to surf those waves.
Yeah.
And I do this wave image or metaphor. So when I work with clients, I spend many weeks just surfing the small waves. Just what was something that happened in your day today that was difficult and not a big deal. Like, we're not working with the sort of the Voldemort or the end of level baddie. We're just choosing those smaller, more digestible experiences. We're bringing those into awareness. We're noticing what the somatic experience is of them, what the emotions are, the sensations, what behaviors it provokes. We're becoming more present to those. And then we're allowing the discharge to happen. So we're working these smaller waves, then medium waves, and then the client hopefully is able to hold the sort of big T traumas and stay resourced and be able to go through those activation and discharge cycles without becoming overwhelmed. So that's my intention for how I work. That's the model. Of course, it doesn't always pan out like that. And then I think it's just about having that therapeutic relationship and being able to hold the client in those moments and also allow them. Sometimes that's important, just to let the overwhelm, just to go through that with the client.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for taking us through that. You yourself also, you went through asthma and you made all of these lifestyle changes. You were working through your history as well. How did you overcome asthma? I know that's a big milestone for you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I'm the sixth of seven children in my home. And my parents, when I was an infant, they went on a holiday for the first time after having six children. And when I was around 2 or 3 years old, they went away for, I think, 4 days, and they left me with loving aunts and all my siblings. But I cried inconsolably for 4 days. And when my parents came back, my breathing had changed. And then I had asthma basically for the next 35 years. I had very strong asthma. So there's another trauma. But maybe there was a sensitivity, but that event triggered my first experience of asthma, which meant that throughout my childhood and adult life, I would be in the hospital. I would be taking a nebulizer to breathe. And I always had the blue inhaler, which many people will be familiar with, as well as steroid inhalers. And if you asked me to draw a picture of my lungs 10 years ago, I would have drawn the image on the outside of a cigarette box. I thought that my lungs were completely damaged, were scarred, that the tissue was bad. To be perfectly honest, I thought that it would impact my life going forward and even my life expectancy. I always had this idea that it would have more of an impact as I got older. So my asthma, I really transformed it in 3 stages. I think the first stage was when a friend of mine had been in an Ayurvedic retreat in India in 2011. And the first thing that they did in the retreat center was they gave each person a roll of tape to tape their mouth shut at nighttime. And he came back from India and said, "Look, guys, you've got to try this. It really improved my breathing." So that was the first time I used mouth tape. I think that's become so popular these days. But that was the first sort of significant shift in my breathing. Nasal breathing instead of mouth breathing. That had a big impact. And the second thing that happened was that I was at a retreat center. I was teaching a retreat. I was deeply immersed in the yoga and meditation community. And when you're in that community, the answer to everything seems to be more brown rice and lentils. If your health isn't good, if your skin's not good, you need to eat more brown rice and lentils or more chickpeas or more stuff, whatever it might be. Now, on this day, I was leading the retreat and I was very sleepy. I was very bloated. I could feel like I wasn't doing well. In the meditations, I was falling asleep. I wasn't in a good space. And I happened to be hanging out with the cook of the retreat center. And she had just come back from an appointment with a functional medicine doctor. And the doctor had told her that she was allergic to beans and rice and chickpeas and lentils, all of these things that were on the menu. And I had a eureka moment. And when I think about it, I think that I am too. So I started to eat a more keto diet. I followed the autoimmune protocol. I eliminated so much stuff out of my diet. And in the end, my diet is probably more on the keto, paleo spectrum. But that had a huge impact on my breathing. That was the second major factor in changing how I breathe. I was mouth taping every night. I was eating this paleo diet. My breathing was significantly better for the first time in my life. But I still had asthma and I was still using my inhaler regularly. And I remember that when I was a child, I remember hearing this word buteyko. And I remember somebody recommending me to go to a buteyko specialist. And unfortunately, I was never taken to the buteyko specialist. But the word always stuck in my mind. And around the age of 35, I started reading about buteyko. Konstantin Buteyko was a physician, I think Ukrainian physician in 1950s, and he was helping people with breathing difficulties, with asthma. And I'm going to butcher the quote, but the quote is something like this, that nobody ever suspected that the heavy breathing, the mouth breathing, and the noisy breathing of an asthmatic was not the symptom, but the cause. As an asthmatic, you think that the symptom of your asthma is that you can't breathe, you feel air hunger all the time, your breathing is noisy. What Konstantin Buteyko understood was that actually it's these breathing patterns that are the cause of asthma. So, what does that mean? I'll just give you an example, something that I don't think many people are aware of, but an asthmatic will typically breathe 1.5 to 2 times more air than a non-asthmatic. So the problem isn't volume of air, the problem is efficiency. Okay, so there's a problem with being able to get the oxygen from the lungs, from the air that we breathe in, into the body's tissues. So Konstantin Buteyko, he understood that asthmatics, they suffer from hypersensitivity to carbon dioxide. I'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of breathing because I find this fascinating and it's quite easy to teach, the biochemistry of breathing. So whenever you breathe air into your lungs, it binds to the hemoglobin in the red blood cells, and then the heart pumps that through the body. So each molecule of hemoglobin binds to 4 molecules of oxygen. And the bond between hemoglobin and oxygen is very strong, but it's weakened in an acidic environment. So oxygen is an alkaline. Carbon dioxide is an acid. If you don't have enough carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, the oxygen can't break away from the hemoglobin and go into the body's tissues. And then you start to get into this feeling of air hunger. And then what happens? Well, you start to breathe more and you start to get rid of more carbon dioxide. When you go running or when you're doing exercise, you start to breathe more. The reason you start to breathe more is because the body's trying to get rid of carbon dioxide. Typically, mouth breathing is the biggest problem. There's not enough resistance when you breathe through the mouth. And we're supposed to breathe through the nose because there's more resistance. What it does is that it optimizes the relationship between carbon dioxide and oxygen, and then it makes the breathing process more efficient. Okay, you have a period of illness, maybe when you're a child, and your nose has been blocked for 3 weeks because you've been in kindergarten and everybody keeps getting sick and your nose is blocked. That often becomes chronic. The nose remains blocked and the person can become a chronic mouth breather, which would be my experience of my childhood. And then you have these nerve cells called chemoreceptors, which measure the acidity of the blood. They're a bit like the thermostat in the house. And when they measure the acidity of the blood, they're measuring the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood. And those become hypersensitized. They become faulty, a bit like the thermostat on your home heating system. It becomes faulty. And that makes you prematurely hyperventilate. An asthmatic, they're always breathing too much air. And the impact of this is to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the body, and to decrease the efficiency of your breathing. Okay, to cut a long story short, the mouth taping was a very important piece. Then changing my diet, because that got rid of a lot of inflammation. It meant my airways were open, my nose was open. I could breathe properly through my nose. And then doing breath hold exercises following an exhalation. It's very simple. You have to do it as a practice because you want to get those sort of neuroplastic changes to the chemoreceptors. And you're doing breath hold exercises following an exhalation, maybe for 10 or 15 minutes a day. And that starts to create these neuroplastic changes to the chemoreceptors that increases their tolerance to carbon dioxide. And it starts to make the breathing process much more efficient. And these three things together combined, I have not used my inhalers now in many years. I don't use them anymore. And I never imagined a future where I would be living without inhalers. And when I think of my lungs now, I have a picture of like healthy trees upside down in my lungs, and very different than that image of the cigarette box that I thought of my lungs. Yeah, I think now I have great healthy lungs and I breathe. It's not just for asthmatics. What I see, Dr. Mala, when I'm working with people, we have a simple protocol for testing how functional someone's breathing is. And 95% of the people I work with have significant room for improvement. And I think this is also important when their breathing starts to improve, and we can track someone's improvement in a very simple way. But when it starts to improve, every small improvement, my clients report it to me back as a shift in their experience of stress in their body. It's small improvement of breathing because it's one of the just foundational rhythms in our being. It's the foundation of our nervous system, good breathing. And that really transforms. It is deeply transformative for people.
Absolutely. Not only your journey is amazing, but the work that you're doing to be able to guide people through that for themselves is also amazing and so needed.
And
Yeah.
I have to say, Dr. Mallet, it's extremely simple. It's very
Mhm.
simple and very easy to make the changes, and it happens fast. I was working with someone last week who was told when she was a child that she could never run in her life.
Mm,
And today in winter, she's running every day for the
wow.
40 years old. And that's from a very short period of work. It is remarkable.
Absolutely. That's so good. So recovery is a big part of your life. It's a big part of what you do, you help people with. And we always land on a last question, which is our favorite question here. What does recovery mean to you?
For me, the answer is very clear, actually. Recovery is about letting go of the patterns of mind, of sensation, of behavior, of thoughts that have become deeply embedded and that are not serving us anymore. At one point, they may have been very adaptive, but they're no longer serving us. It's about letting go. It's about allowing things to be as they are and not holding on to old patterns. We can really hold on to old stuff, and those things, they drive us. They're really unconscious drivers. And sometimes we have to put a lot of work in. It takes some effort. Yeah, with the understanding that in a way we're not trying to become something new. We're not trying to take on something new. We're letting go of something old that doesn't serve us anymore.
Beautiful. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Recovery.com podcast. For additional information, resources, and to access treatment options, please visit our website at Recovery.com. We appreciate your listenership and are excited to have you join us on our next show coming soon.